So, as you are probably well aware, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a never-ending, constantly changing game, full of very interesting interactions amongst the 10,000 plus card pool. I'd like to have a discussion about what the difference between what I would like to call a mesh deck and a pure deck. So a mesh deck to me is a deck that just uses multiple engines to achieve its goal of trying to win. Whereas a pure deck only uses just one archetype. You might have other staple cards that are a part of a different archetype, but for the most part, you're running basically only that archetype and its tech cards. And now, of course, this really only applies to a main deck, of course, because, I mean, an extra deck can have just about anything. Hell, sometimes it can have nothing at all. Monarch players. So I'm mainly just going to talk about what I think the differences between building a mesh deck and building a pure deck are. Of course, my philosophies may not be 100% on point. There might be something I'm missing, or there might be something I'm onto. But this is what I ultimately think how building a mesh deck versus how building a more pure style deck kind of goes for typical Yu-Gi-Oh players. And of course, anybody who wants to test, maybe share their own ideas, is more than welcome to do so below. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the two decks I have for examples today to help express some of my points. We're going to be taking a look at a branded Chimera, or actually, this is a runic Chimera build. And then we have a pure Exo Sisters deck. Well, I mean, almost. There's a couple tech cards, but again, we're going to get into that in a moment. One of the differences I think goes into building a more of a mesh style of deck. I don't know if you notice here, but, well, there's not a whole lot of hand traps. And a lot of the tech cards are built more for one thing, if you notice that. Yeah, you see the Midor and the Keldo. You'll have the 1 Albez. So it's kind of a branded mesh, but for the most part, it's basically just Chimera Runic. But again, there's no hand traps. You have counters to the hand traps. And in these other builds I managed to find, you'd actually also notice that they basically run the hand traps like the Ash Blossom, but then they either side deck or main deck 3 copies of Crossout Designator. If you're running hand traps, you're running the counters to those hand traps. Why is that? So, pure builds, I'll come to find that they'll try to bait a hand trap with random tech cards. Or tech cards that are superfluous, especially if they already have the card they're trying to search. Like a Rhoda, for example. They'll try to bait the Ash with a Rhoda. Whereas a deck that's running multiple engines, it might be harder for your opponent to pinpoint as to what exactly they should be hitting and when. Because you have like 5 different engines running around doing their thing. That might also influence a mesh player to not try to bait as hard, whereas the pure build is going to basically use the rotor first in hopes that you hit it. Because their other plays that are going to come down the line are more important in hindsight. So, of course, that just begs the question, why do they emphasize having the counter for the hand trap more than the pure deck? Well, the answer is simple. If your opponent does find out what to hit and exactly when, that might just be the end of your turn. You have 4 different engines you can't resolve currently residing in that deck, buddy. So, one hand trap can make or break them. Sometimes they can actually get around one Ash Blossom very easily in a mesh deck. It might be harder to do that in a pure deck, but it depends on the combos. But you'll mainly notice that either you don't worry about hand traps or you terrifyingly resent your opponent for hand trapping you. Whereas if we look at the more pure Exo Sisters, you'll notice that they basically just double down on the hand traps. 3 copies of Ash Blossom, 3D Shifter, 3 copies of Imperm, and of course 3 copies of that Ghost Mourner that's definitely going to make your opponent mourn the fact that they summoned anything during their turn. Another thing you'll notice when it comes to more pure built decks, beyond like the excessive amount of hand traps, you'll also notice that they'll double down on basically stunning your opponent out because they absolutely need. You'll notice you'll see the 3 Book of Moons. It's like, yeah, those are really relevant. A lot of people will just side deck those, but you can't blame them for main decking it, especially in a format like Castera that we just got out of. Rip Tryhard, by the way. Not really. That motherfucker. You'll also notice that the side deck is basically full of either floodgates or, well, you know what? Solemn is kind of a floodgate. It's a no floodgate. You just say no. But all in all, you definitely notice that a pure deck absolutely has to get its plays off. So you're going to have as many counters to counters as humanly possible. Or just an abundance of hand traps, hoping your opponent can't keep up the pace. Another thing is you'll also notice that pure decks will run more of potentially not good or really not as good members of the archetype. So I basically mean pieces of an archetype, like let's say the Orpha-Scorpio combo from Predator Plants, where it's just a good effect in general for any fusion deck that even if you're not running Predator Plants, you're probably gonna run it anyways. Whereas mesh decks will really just use the ones that are essential to the strategy, which makes sense. It's just one of those things where it's like, I think I've had certain cases where I built like Pure Crusadia, where I would side deck a few copies of Leonis. Now granted, I haven't run Pure Crusadia in forever, but I've just come to notice that's something that we do. Now you notice with the Chimera branded Runic deck, that, of course, they have a lot more outs to certain things that you potentially wouldn't have the outs to in a pure deck. Again, because it has the Runic engine, you are able to run the monster negate, the monster popping back row, the fountain that gets you them back. Like, your engine covers what your hand traps would be covering in a more pure-esque deck. And then you get to just sort of disrupt your opponent with that engine, while the other engines do their job and basically just wipe your opponent's life points out. Pure decks have to kind of stick with one central theme or strategy, whereas, and you'll notice they'll also be more likely to run something like Nibiru. Here, it's like, the outs that you would need a Nibiru for, you more than likely have with the Runic engine. And anything that you can't particularly out will probably be addressed in the side deck. As you'll notice, there can more floodgates, there can only be one. Triple Tactics Thrust, I assume that's for if you were to get nibbed, I think. More than likely for D-Shifter, but there's clearly a game plan going here. Again, and then you'll also notice I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to be out, but you know it's for a boss monster that the Runic deck can't particularly get around. Again, a lot of this varies, it depends on the combo, because a lot of pure decks also have like multiple combos that get around, like a lot of hand traps and a lot of, monsters with Omni Negates. It really depends. It's just, you notice that when you look at this Runic Pile deck, and then you look at the Exosisters deck, you notice that your outs are your hand traps. Here, you notice your outs is your engine. Now, some people might think that a mesh deck might be a little more stronger than a pure deck simply because it has more to work with. It's doing more wombo combo. It's basically doing what it needs to get done. But you can also argue, especially since we just got out of a format where a pure deck was the biggest deck, Castera. I mean, yeah, there have been variants, but for the most part, it is a pure build deck. But I mean, what else did they really need? 3 D-Shifters and a walking, talking Macrocosmos, along with the fact that they all special summon themselves and remove cards. Just the insane effects of one pure archetype was all you ever needed. You may remember a little deck that came out, not the beginning of this year, but the beginning of 2022. Adventure? Yeah. There was a reason why that archetype in general was run into everything. Basically, it just comes down to being so easy. Any deck that just spawns like free tokens that don't have any limitations or restrictions to what they're able to be used for, and then a bunch of generic supporting cards that either add you cards like an Omni Negator or just a straight up equip spell that you equip to your monster, and then you can just send your opponent's cards back to their hand. Like, really guys, at that point, it's really a no-brainer to add those cards to a different archetype. Like, that's why that engine was so popular for so long. It's still kind of run, but you notice that, like, other pure decks are still able to get around it, and there are still plenty of other combo decks, even synchro decks and link decks that really don't even need the adventure package. The adventure package really just works like a DLC pack for deck building. But at the end of the day, all in all, it's also an archetype that basically just influences a mesh sort of strategy. I don't think I've ever seen a pure adventure deck, which really goes to show that not every deck is sort of built as this sort of like omnipresence of a deck where it's going to basically be like Dogmatica. Like, honestly, I think that was, if you used both Dogmatica and the adventure engines as comparisons, you notice that they're both one family of cards that totally support 2 separate types of deck building: the mesh and the pure build. Although Dogmatica was running through a lot of other things like fusion, shit all invoked, but well, inherently it was designed to be its own thing. Why do you think it got rituals? It's so out of bounds to what the cards were used for. It just makes you wonder if their ultimate philosophy of the Dogmatica design was always meant to be more catered to a pure build of Dogmaticas rather than splashing it into other engines. Although the existence of Nadir's servant might disprove that, at the same time it is sort of a lore thing. Whereas adventure, it's just like, again, someone show me a pure adventure build. I mean, I believe it exists, but it just kind of goes to show that even Konami R&D seems to have this sort of philosophy where some cards are designed to be splashable. Other cards are meant to just run together as a unit and do what they do and kick ass. Dark Lot 2.0!